Demotivated employees already were a $500 billion a year problem for U.S. businesses. Then along came COVID-19. So what now? What about demotivated employees in the age of COVID? Well, we get to talk to an expert about employee demotivation and what to do about it, Tara Peters. Let's get started by you telling our audience a little bit about yourself and your company.
So my name is Tara Peters, and I have been in education for, almost 26 years now. I came to it by accident. I ended up teaching at my son's school as a secondary math instructor and loved it. Almost 10 years later, I was principal and then made a transition on into higher ed. So clearly, I love the educational space. I do know it's my passion and it's my calling, and I've had the pleasure of being now at Northwood University for almost 17 years. I've served in a variety of capacities, both on the faculty and administrative side, but my current role is as academic dean for our undergraduate and graduate operations in Texas. And then I also have a role as a faculty member in our graduate school teaching in our MBA and organizational leadership program. So that's my professional space. I'll talk a little bit about the company. So the Leadership Doctors is the consulting firm that I started with my business partner in March of 2020. It came about as a result of a book that we'd written together called The Demotivated Employee. And Kathy and I were colleagues at Northwood University for several years. Kathy has gone on to do some other things professionally. Of course, I'm still at Northwood, but we were great colleagues at the time, and we had this opportunity to write a book together. And so it just made sense as an outgrowth of that to start a consulting business. And really our focus is around helping organizations to create great workplaces. So we focus in on organizational culture, we focus in on leadership development. And so we're really trying to help companies to really be their best selves so that they can actually support, develop, and grow their people.
Now, you have written a book about demotivated employees. Now, a lot of our people in management will say, well, wait a minute, that's like writing a book about everybody knows employees are demotivated and have been for centuries. So what's going on with demotivated employees? And perhaps more contemporarily, what's going on with demotivated employees and COVID-19?
So I would agree that demotivation has been an issue that we have been talking about really for decades now. And so it kind of begs the question, why haven't we fixed it? Because there's a lot of research out there that's given us best practices and tools around what organizations can do. And a part of the argument that Kathy and I make in the book is that, one, that demotivation is not the opposite of motivation, in part because it's caused by different factors. And we talk about those 5 sources in our book. And the other argument that we make is that we're not cynics. We believe that leaders are actually unintentionally demotivating their employees with their behaviors. And so we really offer up evidence-based strategies that leaders can adopt in terms of the practices and behaviors that they will engage in so that their employees will maintain their motivation, because most people, when they join an organization, are highly motivated. Something happens to them after they join. And then we talk to leaders about, hey, if your employees do fall into a motivational slump, here are some things that you can do. And so relative to COVID, this is really important because one of the sources of demotivation that we talk about in the book is stress. And so you can imagine right now that employees are dealing with a variety of stressors, whether it is from the job, uncertainties around employment, maybe their hours have been cut, maybe they are having to adapt to new ways of working in terms of new systems or no longer being in the office, and what do those adaptations mean. And so really helping employees during this time is important. And so there are things leaders can do. For example, checking in with their employees, not assuming that all is going on well because employees are silent, but actually touching bases with them, checking in, and then helping employees to problem solve around issues that they are having. And really that support, that being empathetic and that troubleshooting with employees can really go a long way towards helping them to manage their stress and to deal with the issue of demotivation.
Now, it's sometimes that we just can't see the forest for the trees. We're so involved with putting out the fire that burst out this morning, and then the fire that came during lunch hour, etc. So, as managers, what should we be looking for to detect demotivation and at its earliest possible signs?
So one of the things that I would say to managers is one, to just check in with your employees. You'd be surprised, just the simple thought in the form of a question: how are you doing? How are things going? You would be surprised how appreciative employees will be just for you checking in. Another thing for managers to just notice is behavioral changes in employees. So suddenly if you have an employee who was typically really outgoing and engaged and involved in meetings, and you see that particular employee beginning to shrink back, you begin to see that employee not engaging as much, that's a great opportunity for you to check in as a manager to see what is going on. The other thing that I would say is to look for changes in the quality of work or productivity. Those can often be signals that something is going on with your employee, and coming to it from a place of you're noticing, but you're not here to blame, you're here to help. And so adopting that mindset with employees as a manager, I think is really important. And then I also think it's important to be proactive. As a leader, you understand that your employees are actually in a very new space in terms of COVID. And so what are the kinds of things that you can do? Well, one of those things is to communicate. In fact, over communicate. So sharing with employees, giving them updates, letting them know what's going on. Because when there's a vacuum, it's not that employees aren't talking. It's not that they aren't creating a reality. They're just, it may not be based in truth. And so you want to put employees in a situation to be informed and to know, and not to be guessing and to be making things up. So communication is really, really important in terms of a leader during this time. But also, I would argue that's really a practice that you would want to have as a part of your ongoing ways of leading those in your group.
How formal should this communication be? I.e., are we talking taking the annual performance review and making that a daily performance review?
So I would argue that communication will take on different forms. And so one of the things that I would say is a simple way to do this is just to have weekly check-ins with your employees. If you have a small group, you might be able to do that on a daily basis, but certainly you want to be checking in with your team on a weekly basis. Again, that's as simple as picking up the phone and making a phone call. Other ways to communicate with your teams are having Zoom meetings, just like you and I are doing today. That's another way to engage with your teams. Another way to do that is obviously through email correspondence that might have a more formal structure to it, but you also want to create two-way dialogue. And so you want your employees to also know that in addition to your outreach and your communication, that they can actually reach out to you when problems or situations come up, and you can actually talk through those with your employees and to support them. And so I would not wait until your formal performance review process to have communications with your employees, because again, really, I would argue that's too late in the game in terms of ongoing engagement with employees. But having those structured touch points, and they can be formal and informal, but you want to make sure that you're reaching out to your employees and those lines of communication are open, and that you're helping to facilitate that.
And I suspect that the old adage of praise in public and criticize in private still applies.
I would agree with that 100%. I mean, you can imagine how demotivating that can be to an employee to be called out publicly in terms of something that has gone awry, in terms of maybe not meeting a deadline or product quality not being there. And so you do want to attend to that and to make sure that you're causing employees to perform in ways that you want them to, but not allowing your feedback to get in the way of your being able to do that effectively. And the other kind of little caveat here is sometimes, you know, someone might say, well, I saw something really dangerous or something really consequential going on. In that particular instance, you can give feedback in that moment in time, but do it in a way that isn't going to put the employee in a defensive posture, but you're correcting it, and then you go on later to have a more substantive conversation with what you're seeing that is done with the employee one-on-one or in some type of a coaching session. So that allows the employee to then get the feedback, but also allows them to maintain their sense of worth as well in the process.
It's time to put the batteries in your crystal ball. How do you how do you think this is going to play out in the time after COVID? Because eventually we're going to somehow come out of this.
Well, so here's what I would say. If I had a crystal ball, and I'm going to pretend right now that I do, I would say a couple of things about once we come out of COVID. One of the things I would say is that we will have a new view on how work actually works. We, in some respects, have been really pigeonholed and myopic in our view of how work can get done in terms of this idea that we all need to be in an office setting, right? There are certain kinds of processes that need to be in place in terms of how we organize ourselves. And so I really believe that COVID has given us an opportunity to reimagine the world of work and to show that there are different ways for employees to be productive and to still allow the organizational goals to be met. So I think we're going to reimagine the world of work. I think the other thing that we're going to be thinking about too, as well, is what does it mean in order to do risk assessment and plan for the unexpected? Obviously, pandemics are not typically something that organizations do as a part of their strategic planning. But what does that mean for organizations when a major disruption actually occurs and causes you to have to change your fundamental business model in a really, really short period of time? And so I think these questions around how organizations are able to be more adaptive and responsive to business needs and customer needs, I think is going to be really important as we think about post-COVID and what we actually do in terms of our operations.
This is a little bit off the subject, but as an educator, where do you think higher education is going to be in the years ahead? Is it going to be more and more and more online? What about your own situation at your college?
So what I will say is there was an article published by Bloomberg pre-COVID that said 70% of faculty in higher ed had never taught a course online. I know that's kind of shocking. And you have multiple institutions who prior to COVID had not really adopted any kind of strategic focus on online education, particularly in the credit space. They may have done it some for continuing education or what we call non-credit purposes, but not really for degree-seeking purposes. And so this has really forced higher education to reimagine the delivery of courses and degree programs for students. And those entities, quite frankly, who are able to adapt and to deliver a high-quality online education are going to be well-positioned for the future. Because what we have to imagine is, even if you think about right now what the experts are saying, the best case scenario for a vaccination is maybe late 2020, more likely sometime in 2021. Then that has to be scaled up. We need hundreds of millions of doses of the vaccine, and that's assuming a single dose per citizen in the world. And so what does that mean for higher ed, with the idea that you would not be able to adapt in terms of offering online education, because face-to-face in our traditional models where we brought students together in large groups to campuses for a learning experience may not be possible in its previous form for maybe 2 or 3 years. And so if you think about that just operationally from a financial perspective, that will not be sustainable for many institutions in higher ed. And so my own institution, Northwood University, we've been doing online education since the 90s. So this is not a new space for us. Our undergrad, our graduate degree programs have been available either face-to-face or online for several years now. And so to that extent, this has really been an issue of us scaling, not having to actually create from scratch. But I do believe that higher ed will have to reinvent itself in terms of how it actually offers education. But the good news about COVID is it's forcing people to change that perhaps never would have, and letting them know that online education was done well can actually be very successful. And I know you didn't ask this question, but it's also impacting K to 12, honestly, as well. Because now we're having to imagine, how do we deliver online education for students who are in K to 12? Because again, the virus will not be gone in the fall of 20, and how many parents are going to be comfortable sending their children to a school setting, and quite frankly, how many faculty and staff are going to be comfortable or even able to go back into a building in the fall because of pre-existing conditions, potential morbidity issues in terms of their own health. So these are questions that we're grappling with in higher ed, but also in K to 12 education.
You have been very generous with your ideas, and I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this, but what would you like to add that I haven't asked you?
One of the things I would say is that I think that this is a great time for you and I to be creative. I think it's a great time for you and I to be to imagine what our lives might be like, what our world, particularly our world of work, could be as we move forward. I think it's a great time for us to challenge and push the boundaries in terms of the status quo, because there's this openness to change right now that may not have been present prior to COVID, but the window of opportunity won't be open infinitely. And so I would just issue this charge to be creative, to be imaginative, and think about what your business could be, what it could be like, and then begin to be intentional in terms of those steps that you might make.